our second presenter, who work for amazing species, biggest predators on the east. He has different names. It's a polar bear, white bear, marine bear. This is a name of a single species who live in desert, like a taiga, but this is a snowy and very cold desert, Arctic desert. It's like a taiga, polar bear is highly adapted to the extreme climate condition. And I love to introduce you Dr. Steven Amstrup, who work for the polar bear conservation, for the Polar Bear International. He worked more than 3 years for protection and studying beautiful polar bear that face it with numerous threats like climate change and poaching. Steven is winner of very prestigious Indianapolis Prize, and he's a recipient of Bembe Award. Please meet Dr. Amstrup.
Thank you. Very good. Well, thank you, Elena, and thank you to everybody who is here at this last talk of the day. I know you're all tired, and it's been a long day, but I think a very interesting day and a rewarding day. I thank you for coming, and I also want to thank everybody at WCN for inviting us here. This is my first time at an expo, and Polar Bears International, first time here. We are very honored and pleased to be here. So today I'm going to try and give you a little bit of an introduction to polar bears. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Polar Bears International does, and then I'm going to try and connect some dots about why we all might be concerned and want to care about polar bears. When I had my talk reviewed yesterday, Tracy suggested that, well, you don't have anything in here about how you came to be doing polar bear research, and nobody here knows you. You're a first-time speaker, so add a few slides to describe that. So I feel like I'm a really, really lucky guy. When I was 5 or 6 years old, I knew that I wanted to go into the woods and study bears. And I had an opportunity as a graduate student to study black bears in Idaho. I was involved in some of the very first work where radio telemetry was used to help understand movements and distribution of bears. So I feel really lucky about that. And then I took a little bit of a hiatus from working on bears. I worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Wyoming studying pronghorn antelope and sharp-tailed grouse. Gave me a little bit of a diversity in my background. But in 1979, I got a surprise phone call from a fellow named Clyde Jones. I was a junior researcher in the Denver Wildlife Research Center, and he was the director. And Clyde was this big guy. He reminded me a lot of Lyndon Johnson. And I think many in the audience remember something about Lyndon Johnson. He could be very intimidating, and you didn't want to cross him. And so when a junior researcher gets a phone call from this guy, you got to wonder, what did I do? And yes, and he said, Steve, I'd like you to go to Alaska and take over our fledgling polar bear project. So that's how I came to go to Alaska. And this is one of those pictures that my wife tells me I can't show anymore because I don't look like that anymore. But I had an opportunity. Tracy said I should do it. So anyway, and I was in charge of polar bear research in Alaska for 30 years. And again, I was very lucky because I started working on polar bears at a time when people were just trying to figure out how to do it. We didn't even know enough to know the right questions to ask in a lot of cases. And I was lucky enough to put together a great research team, and we accomplished a lot of things, I think. So with that, we'll get back to the question of why we should care about polar bears. They're interesting and captivating creatures in a lot of ways. They live in a very challenging habitat. But let's start with the basics. They're the world's largest four-legged predator. They have feet the size of platters. They can have a 45 or 50-inch neck, be 10 feet long. And a big adult male can stand 5 feet high at the shoulder when standing at all fours. And I can tell you, if you're out on the sea ice, standing there, and one of these guys walks up, he looks as big as a house. But like all bears and all large carnivores, they start out in life small and vulnerable. They have many interesting behaviors. One of the most popular is the boxing or dancing that they do on the shoreline of Hudson Bay in the autumn. Within a week or two of the present time, they'll be doing this on the coastline up there. Some of you have been up there to see it. Pretty interesting behavior. Polar bears are also kind of metabolic marvels, not marbles. They have the ability to undergo tremendous changes in their weight, sometimes doubling their body mass and then losing all of that body fat during times when food is short. And they do that without affecting their blood sugar levels or their blood insulin levels. People in the medical field are very interested to understand how bears do that. They're the most mobile of all four-legged creatures, as far as I know. This slide shows an example of one female that we radio tracked for going on 3 years in the 90s and early 2000s. And just to give you an idea of the scale, from Barrow here to the point of the Tuck Peninsula is approximately 1,000 kilometers. The largest activity areas that we recorded for radio-collared female polar bears were 600,000 plus square kilometers. That's about the size of Kenya. So they're highly, highly mobile animals. We don't really understand entirely why some of them move as much as they do, but it's very interesting. They live at the top of the world. This is the kind of map that polar bear scientists are accustomed to looking at, looking down at the North Pole. And they live in the ocean surrounding the North Pole. What this means is that they live in an ice environment. And this is classic polar bear habitat in the spring of the year. And I find it amazing. How many here, raise your hands, would think that you could look at that moonscape and say that's where I'd expect to see the largest carnivores in the world? Not very likely, but indeed they thrive there. It's pretty amazing. And they depend on the sea ice for essentially all of their life history needs. They breed out there, they raise their cubs out there. In some cases, they actually enter their maternal dens and give birth out on the sea ice. Most importantly, they feed out there. They feed on 2 species of seals, the ring seal, which is about 150 pounds as an adult. They're called ring seals because of the ring-like pattern in their fur. Bearded seals are much larger, and they're called bearded seals for obvious reasons. Polar bears catch seals by sneaking up on them when they haul out on the top of the ice in the spring. They wait for them at breathing holes, and I can only imagine that ring seals have a terrifying life because they're air-breathing mammals. They live under the ice. They have to come up and breathe, and they know that sometimes polar bears are waiting for them. In the spring of the year, ring seals create these subnivean or under snow layers. These are little caves that are above the surface of the sea ice and below the surface of the snow. It's in these caves that they give birth to their white-coated pups. This is my wife, Virginia, with a pup that we found abandoned on the ice on the one trip that she was able to make with me up into the Arctic. And polar bears have become very astute at finding these structures and removing their occupants. So hold your breath. If you're a ring seal, this is your worst nightmare. But everybody's got to eat. Now, you've all heard that the sea ice is in decline and that that's a challenge for polar bears. This is where I would show you a graph showing the decline in sea ice over the last 30 years, but I was told not to show any graphs. So instead, I'm going to show you a movie, and it's already started, but you see, this is September sea ice. It began in 1902, and it's going all the way up to 2100. And the white is the ice. So what I have to ask myself is, if I'm a female polar bear trying to raise my cubs in the summer of 2100, where am I going to go to find prey? A little closer version of that is my study area in northern Alaska, where we worked on bears my first year up there. The top row is my first 4 years. The bottom row is my last 4 years. I left Alaska in 2010. And you can see that there's quite a difference. When I first went to Alaska in the early 1980s, I could stand on the beach in the summertime and see the sea ice. And if I was lucky and had a spotting scope, I might see a polar bear out there patrolling for seals. Now the sea ice is beyond the curvature of the Earth. It's so far away you can't see it. It's open water. It's open ocean. And what does that mean for polar bears? Well, here's a slide. These gold dots are radio tracking locations from the month of September. That's the month of minimum sea ice between 1985 and 1995, before we started to see the dramatic declines in sea ice. And what you can see, you don't have to be a mathematician to figure out that where those bears like to be, there's no longer any sea ice. Due to declining sea ice, we've seen a whole variety of negative effects. We've seen declining body stature, declining weights, unusual movement patterns, unusual feeding patterns, and perhaps the most important thing is we've seen a lot of declining survival rates. And when we say that survival rates are declining, what we're saying is that more polar bears are starving to death. And starvation is not a pretty picture. In 2007, our research team put together a series of 9 reports that led to the conclusion that by the middle of this century, because of sea ice loss, that we could lose 2/3 of the world's polar bears. All the polar bears in this green area here and in this area here. And that includes those bears that I'd spent most of my adult life with. And we could lose them all by the end of the century. Now that prediction was met with some degree of concern that, well, we were already too late to save polar bears. There was a lot of coverage in the general media that polar bears are threatened and it's too late to help them. They were proposing that there was a tipping point in the sea ice, and we'd already crossed it. Our temperatures were too warm, and sea ice was going to just decline irreversibly and unstoppably. And I didn't think that that was the message that we had said. And so we began to look at what we could investigate about whether that was true. But before we could do that, we had to understand why was it that the sea ice was declining. And I think everybody here has heard about global warming. Global warming results because the energy from the sun that comes in as shortwave radiation is having an ever more difficult time getting back out into space. If it doesn't return back out into space, ultimately the Earth would become a ball of molten rock or hot gas. But for the moment, it's just causing the Earth to warm ever more. And now this isn't a graph, so don't worry about it. This is a drawing. There's no data. But what I want to show is basically the issue of the certainty and uncertainty of global warming that allowed us to make those long projections into the future. So think of this as, here we've got temperature. It could be some other climate variable, and we have time. And we know that the climate over time varies. We know of El Nino and La Nina and volcanic eruptions and all of those things that can cause long-term, sometimes multi-decadal swings in the climate. Over the top of that is the shorter term and more localized variation in the weather. But the important thing is that if we're in an environment like we've been for, say, the last 10,000 years, where greenhouse gas concentrations are relatively stable, the average of all of that fluctuation is a flat line. Not so if greenhouse gas concentrations are constantly rising. We still have all that same fluctuation. We still have the possibility of El Nino and La Nina and the Atlantic currents to change what we see in the near term. But in the long term, we know that we've just got a rising baseline. So when people talk about the uncertainty in climate change, they're talking about these humps and bumps. The certainty is that the average of all those humps and bumps is an ever-rising baseline. And when we projected the future of polar bears, we were projecting out into the middle or the latter part of the century, where we're up in here someplace. All the climate models suggest by that time, we're going to be in an area where all that natural variation is beyond anything we've ever experienced. So that's a nutshell of how we felt confident in being able to project the future for polar bears. And the point is that uncertainty doesn't necessarily translate into unreliability. In addressing the challenge of the future of polar bears, we put together another team. We looked at the future of polar bears. We found out there is no tipping point in the sea ice. We found out that saving polar bears is all about cutting greenhouse gas emissions and stopping the rise in temperature. We also showed that there are a lot of other things we can do on the ground while we're doing that to make a better world for polar bears. And that's what Polar Bears International is about. I'm going to give you a very quick rundown. We basically are doing research, monitoring, supporting research and monitoring of others, and using that information to inform our messaging. One of the things that we do every fall is a coastal survey, counting polar bears as they go offshore. And this is not a great map, I apologize for that, but this is Hudson Bay, so this is ocean out here. This is a coastline, and those are our polar bear observations. We have a citizen science learning program that we're developing so that people who come up to see polar bears can actually start to collect data to help us do the monitoring. There's a lot of places in the polar bear world where people come to visit, but where we don't have very good data. And if we can develop this method, we can apply it to many places around the world. We have a monitoring program that was started in the early 2000s in northern Alaska, monitoring polar bears as they come out of their dens. And they are now using that. This is done in conjunction with a colleague of mine, Dr. Tom Smith from Brigham Young. And they are now using cameras to do this. When we first started it, we were camping out on the sea ice, and we found out that camping out for a week at minus 40 was just not very much fun. So Tom figured out that he could do it with cameras. I'll just tell you that in Churchill, we have 5 polar bear cams. These are deployed with the aid of explore.org, and these give people the opportunity to view polar bears on the tundra from any place in the world. And in fact, the camera operators can be any place in the world because it's all done over the internet. And last year we had over 500,000 unique visits to our site. Many people just don't have the ability to get up and see polar bears in the wild, but we give them that opportunity to do it virtually. We do a lot of outreach and education, giving lectures, talks, universities to administrators, government leaders, that sort of thing. A lot of media outreach. I've done about 200 media interviews since polar bears were listed as a threatened species. We have an outreach program that we do from the tundra. This is going to start next week, where we bring scientists up to the tundra. They sit in these big school bus-like vehicles called tundra buggies, and we have high-speed video out to them, or out to the tundra, and then they can broadcast and communicate with students all around the world. Last year, we reached over 80,000 students in classes, various places, mostly in North America, but a few in Europe and even in Australia. Last year, Google Street View came to Churchill, and we helped them get images, and I think they even got a few polar bears on their image. We work a lot with young leaders, and one of our programs is Polar Bear, Project Polar Bear, and this challenges our youth to come up with ways to change their community in ways that will help polar bears. And this group came up, this was one of the winning groups, and they came up with this anti-idling campaign. We have a polar bear tracker on our website where people can log into our website and see polar bears in near real time moving around, and then get all this information about polar bears. There are curricula associated with that, so classrooms can take advantage of it in a more formal teaching setting. So, a lot of people don't like the cold. What if you don't care about the Arctic? Should you still care about polar bears? And that brings up the 800-pound gorilla that's been in the room all day. And that gorilla is that polar bears are not the only species that are being affected or going to be affected by climate change. Unabated climate warming ultimately will affect all species on Earth. All the ones we've been talking about today. I have some colleagues that have told me, well, I'm not too worried about climate change because our species uses a broad variety of habitats, and if some of them get too dry or too hot, they can move over here. And that's true. And we expect a lot of them to do that. But ultimately, all of those habitats are going to change. Now, for many species, we got way bigger issues, more urgent than this. But we need to think about the long term. So the brown Argus butterfly was heralded a couple of years ago as a winner in climate change because it was a species that occurred just in the southern tier of the British Isles, very limited distribution, and as the climate has warmed, it's spread, it's burgeoning throughout the middle of the country and moving north every year. But in all of the papers I saw about it, nobody ever mentioned what they were going to be saying when it blinks out at the top of Scotland because it's too warm. Same thing with a lot of the populations that we've been hearing about today that essentially occupy sky islands. There's only so much altitude you can go, and then what happens? Lori Marker and I have been talking about the increase in challenges that she's seeing that are threatening all of the wonderful work that she described today because of climate change, warming, drying habitat. I was talking to Patricia Wright, this year's winner of the Indianapolis Prize, by the way, who's spent her whole life preserving forests in Madagascar, and she's telling me, it's just not the same as it used to be. We're seeing dramatic effects. So it's coming to us all, and it's coming to humans. Humans are also victims of climate change. And the poor of the earth and those who are living closest to the earth are going to be the most severely and the most rapidly affected. In the case of native people of the north, the Inuit, they have a tradition of hunting polar bears and relying on them for food and fiber. That's a challenge right now in some areas where populations are declining. But there's a lot more than that. I mean, their whole lifestyle is being challenged. A theme throughout most of this conference has been the potential conflicts or realized conflicts between humans and the wildlife species that we're interested in preserving, the competition for the same landscape. In 1970, my major professor told me, when the early hunters went out and killed the last mastodon, they didn't know they were killing the last mastodon. All they knew was that they were hungry. 2 years ago, on this stage, Colleen Begg said, hungry people can't do conservation. We know with virtual certainty that if we allow the climate to continue to warm, we're going to have a lot more hungry people. And that's going to impact us all. We can solve this. We showed that we can solve it. We know what the answers are, and actually, they are challenging. No doubt they are challenging. But they're solvable. We know what the answers are. Many people have written many documents about what it would take to do this. We just need to get our act together and turn a possibility into a plausibility. Right now, it's the political plausibility that's standing in our way. So, we need your help. Polar Bears International is a small group trying to do a lot, working in a very expensive and difficult environment. One thing I didn't point out earlier is that in the polar bear habitat, you're always going away from civilization. There's no, you don't go across the bay and then there's something else over there. It's always away. It's the end of the road. And that makes it challenging. PBI can use help in improving our capacity to give talks to groups like this. And I think the most important thing I would ask you all to do is to use whatever pull you have to contact our business leaders and our policy leaders and say, look, We need to work towards a sustainable, non-carbon-based economy. That's the solution. That will help everything we've talked about today, regardless of whether you care about cheetahs but don't care about polar bears. So we should care about polar bears because they're a messenger of the challenge and the promise that we have. Mike Crowther, the director of the president and CEO of the Indianapolis Zoological Society, has a great saying, and I just love it. He said, "We should leave a world that future generations would choose rather than one that they're forced to endure." If we act in time to save polar bears, we will save the world that our children might choose. So I want to thank the rest of our the rest of the PBI team. We're a small group. We're trying to do a lot. I want to thank previous sponsors and current sponsors. And I know I'm over time, but I'm happy to stay and answer questions if anybody has any.